Gain insight into the latest governance issues from prominent thought leaders in corporate governance as Drexel's LeBeau College of Business Center for Corporate Governance presents Evidence and Perspectives.
Senator Schumer's Bill of Rights includes many aspects, including majority voting, the elimination of classified boards, a say-on-pay initiative. It also includes risk committees being mandated for each company, and I'd like to concentrate on that for a moment. Many of those other aspects I think are potentially beneficial, although I'm not convinced they're beneficial for all companies. I'm not convinced they should be mandated, but it's something that individual boards at least should consider. Any or all of those could be good ideas, but mandating separate risk committees strikes me as risky in itself. Risk has to be the purview of the entire board. You can't just parcel out risk. Risk is inherent in every decision a board is making, and boards need to have a careful strategic analysis of risk. If you consider the typical committees that a board has, the audit committees, compensation committees, governance committees, each of those has a risk associated with it, many risks associated with them. Just a simple examples. If you have an inadequate audit, you have a bigger chance of fraud. If you have inadequate compensation, you may encourage excessive risk-taking. If you have poor governance, you're not aligning owners and managers, and you may reduce corporate value. You can't take those risks away from those committees. They have to be considered in those committees themselves. Now, you could argue that a separate committee would focus on some particular aspects of risk. That could be a good idea. In fact, some companies have already decided to do that, primarily financial companies. And I'll note that some of those companies got into trouble anyway. But if companies voluntarily decide that having separate risk committees is a good idea, more power to them. They should have the right to do that. But it has to be that the entire board considers risk and focuses on risk. I don't like mandating separate committees for another reason. It implies a checklist mentality for risk, for analyzing risk. Risk doesn't always follow an orderly, linear process. By its nature, it's rather dynamic and involves the interaction of many elements. Boards have to consider that and be very vigilant of thinking of the normal types of risk and thinking outside the box. A checklist mentality in a single committee is not going to accomplish that. If you think about risk itself too, obviously there's a plus and a minus side to risk. The same could be said of regulation. Regulation, do we need regulation? Well, it's good to ask not only how much shareholder access do we have in the boardroom, how much government access should we have in the boardroom? Now, regulation is certainly needed, but it's a question of how much. Let's consider boards operating to maximize returns. If boards are successful in adapting to changing situations, changing environments, they'll prosper. If they don't, they'll fail, and they should be allowed to fail. So in that situation, boards are really subject to a very Darwinian process. The same can't be said for regulation. Regulation has a pendulum. We go from too little to too much. And unfortunately, it gets stuck on one side, and you can guess which side it gets stuck on. And there are very obvious reasons for that. The events that occur that tell us we have too little regulation are the WorldComs, the Enrons, the financial crisis. It's obvious that we need more regulation when those events occur. It's not obvious what the event is that tell us when we have too much regulation. And so it's tougher to get rid of regulations once they're in place. In addition, regulatory agencies and regulators have a survival instinct of their own. And once in place, they tend to want to preserve the structures they've built. Now, that same criticism can be applied to boards. Boards become entrenched. They need to be held accountable. And so we do need ways to make sure that board members can be freely elected and freely removed. But mandating separate risk committees for each corporation, I think, is not the way to go.